Have you ever wondered what it's like to live in a world where your biggest secret isn't just hidden, it's deadly? Imagine being a parent, looking at your child, knowing that the public only sees the charming, talented facade, while behind closed doors, chaos brews. That was the world of Rob and Michelle Reiner. On the surface, they had it all: Hollywood fame, wealth, a family that seemed perfect. But perfection can be deceiving. Sometimes, it's not the world that notices cracks. It's the people who live inside them. And when those cracks grow, they can swallow everything whole. Rob Reiner, the acclaimed director, actor, and Hollywood icon, spent decades in the spotlight. His work earned him accolades. His family earned admiration. But in the weeks before his death, he confessed something that would shock anyone who thought they knew the Reiner family story. He revealed a truth so dark, so carefully buried, that it called into question everything about the life he had built, the image he had maintained, and the choices he had made as a father. This isn't just a story of fame and tragedy. It's a story of secrecy, regret, and consequences that no amount of influence or money could erase. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The revelation centers on their son, Nick Reiner, a man whose life seemed, at first glance, like that of any Hollywood offspring. The youngest son, with privilege, access, and opportunity. But Nick's story was far from ordinary. Behind the glamorous veneer, he was a storm waiting to erupt, a storm that his parents tried desperately to contain. At age 17, Nick was sent to a private psychiatric facility following a violent outburst. The details of that incident have been shrouded in secrecy for years. And why? Because Rob and Michelle, armed with Hollywood connections and an unyielding desire to protect their family's image, covered it up. They erased records, silenced questions, and preserved a public narrative that was unrecognizable from the private reality. Rob later admitted it was his biggest mistake as a father, a mistake whose consequences would echo far beyond that teenage year. Think about that for a moment. A child showing extreme behavior, a parent trying to manage it with secrecy instead of transparency, and the veneer of perfection preserved at all costs. What would you do if faced with the same choice? Would you protect your child from scrutiny? Protect your family's reputation? Or would you confront the problem head-on, no matter how painful? These are not just rhetorical questions. They are the questions that Rob Reiner lived with, the questions that define the final years of his life, and ultimately, the context for the unimaginable tragedy that would follow. The story of the Reiners takes a darker turn on December 14th, a day that would forever alter the family's legacy. Rob, 78, and Michelle, 70, were found stabbed to death at their $13.5 million Brentwood estate, a home that had once represented safety, luxury, and success. It wasn't just a crime scene. It was the epicenter of a lifetime of secrets coming to a violent, devastating head. The bodies were discovered by their daughter Romy, 27, whose own testimony to the police would highlight the tension and fear that had been quietly building in the household for years. According to reports, Romy warned investigators of a dangerous family member who should be a suspect, an ominous statement that, in hindsight, foreshadowed the shocking revelation to come. Nick Reiner, 32, who had lived in the guest house on the estate, was arrested that very night and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The public reaction was immediate, overwhelming, and conflicted. How could a family so celebrated, so seemingly perfect, produce such violence? How could the same son who had been institutionalized as a teenager, whose outbursts had been hidden and sanitized by his parents, now stand accused of something so unthinkable? And most importantly, could anyone have seen it coming? These questions cut to the heart of the story. The consequences of secrets left to fester, the dangers of prioritizing image over truth, and the human cost of decisions that seemed, at the time, protective but ultimately catastrophic. But let's rewind a bit. Because understanding the tragedy of December 14th requires understanding decades of tension, concealment, and complicated family dynamics. The Reiners were not immune to the pressures of Hollywood life, but they were not ordinary people either. They had the resources to manage crises in ways that most families cannot. They could access private psychiatric care, legal counsel, and media management. Yet even with these advantages, some problems cannot be erased. Some truths have a weight that no amount of influence or money can lift. And for Rob and Michelle, that weight became unbearable. So unbearable that, in the weeks before their deaths, Rob finally admitted the truth about Nick's past. The admission was not just a confession, it was a reckoning. A final, desperate attempt to reconcile the love for his child with the failures he feared he could never repair. Imagine living with that burden. Imagine knowing that the world sees your family as flawless while you carry a secret that could destroy it. Imagine the tension of keeping a child's violent tendencies hidden from friends, colleagues, and the public, all while struggling to maintain the illusion of normalcy. This is the Reiner's reality, a reality that is both relatable and terrifying, because every parent, at some point, wonders if they are doing enough. Every parent questions whether protecting their child might inadvertently harm them. And sometimes, the answer comes too late, in ways that are irreversible. In the coming chapters, we will explore the Reiner's story in meticulous detail. We will start with the early years of Nick's life, uncovering the subtle and not-so-subtle signs that something was amiss. We will examine the decisions Rob and Michelle made, their rationale, and the consequences, both immediate and long-term. We will delve into the psychiatric facility where Nick was sent, the secrecy that surrounded it, and the ethical questions it raises. We will follow the events leading up to the night of the murders, including Romy's discovery, Nick's arrest, and the police investigation. And throughout it all, we will return to the central, haunting question: could this tragedy have been prevented? This story is more than a Hollywood scandal. It's a cautionary tale about secrecy, privilege, and the limits of influence. It is about the cracks that exist in every family, the decisions we make to protect what we love, and the consequences when those decisions are guided by fear instead of transparency. It is about a father who loved his son, a mother who sought to shield her family, and a young man whose life was shaped by the very attempts to contain him. And as we peel back the layers of this story, you will see just how fragile the line between protection and destruction can be. Have you ever met a family that seemed perfect, like every detail was curated, every smile rehearsed, every moment on display flawless? The Reiners were that family. To the world, they were the epitome of Hollywood success. Rob Reiner, the celebrated director and actor whose films had shaped generations, and Michelle, his elegant, poised wife, known for her philanthropic work and the careful grace with which she carried herself through the relentless glare of celebrity culture. Their children, Romy, Nick, and the rest of the family, were seen as lucky heirs to fame and fortune, living lives many could only dream of. But appearances can be deceiving. And in the case of the Reiners, they were not just deceiving the world, they were deceiving themselves. The Reiners' Brentwood estate was a symbol of their success, sprawling, luxurious, with manicured lawns and an aura of privacy that offered both comfort and concealment. Inside, however, the atmosphere was not always serene. Guests recalled tension behind polite smiles, fleeting glances that seemed to hold unspoken words. Staff whispered about arguments muffled behind closed doors. The family appeared cohesive, loving, and supportive, yet there were fissures, small at first, almost imperceptible, but growing with each passing year. Rob's career had always demanded precision and control. On set, he was meticulous, demanding, yet charismatic. Off set, he sought the same order. Michelle, equally commanding in her own right, was the glue holding the family together, balancing Rob's intensity with her calm and measured presence. And in many ways, this balance worked, until it didn't. The very structure that gave the family stability also masked a deeper instability, one that would later explode in ways no one could predict. Nick, the youngest Reiner child, was often described as charming and intelligent, but with an edge that could be both captivating and unnerving. From a young age, there were signs that something in him was different: intense moods, sudden outbursts, and a volatility that set him apart from his peers. These were behaviors that any attentive parent would notice, yet in the Reiners' household, they were carefully managed, often swept under the rug, hidden behind the veneer of wealth, privilege, and Hollywood polish. Friends and acquaintances remember family gatherings as events of laughter and warmth, but those who were closer noticed the subtleties. A flicker of frustration in Rob's eyes, a shadow of fear in Michelle's smile, a quiet tension when Nick's mood shifted. These were not the dramatic incidents of tabloids, but small, telling moments that hinted at an undercurrent of struggle, a storm lurking beneath the surface. It's important to understand that the Reiners were not neglectful parents. Far from it. They loved their children fiercely and went to great lengths to protect them. But there is a difference between protection and concealment, a difference that would prove critical. In an effort to shield Nick from judgment, scrutiny, and perhaps even from himself, Rob and Michelle made decisions that prioritized image over intervention, reputation over transparency. And these decisions would shape the trajectory of their family in ways they could never have imagined. Imagine being a teenager in that environment, brilliant, privileged, but increasingly volatile and misunderstood. Imagine feeling the weight of parental expectations, the pressure to perform, and the consequences of any lapse hidden not just from the public, but from anyone who might have helped. For Nick, adolescence was not merely a time of growth, it was a battlefield. Each emotional eruption, each act of aggression, was both a cry for help and a symptom of a deeper struggle. Yet for those outside the family, it appeared that nothing was wrong. That illusion, that careful curation of normalcy, would soon crumble. Romy, the eldest sibling, often played the role of observer, a witness to the household dynamics. Her perspective offers insight into the duality of the Reiners' existence, a family celebrated publicly for its success and stability, and privately, a family grappling with fear, tension, and secrecy. Her recollections are peppered with contradictions. Moments of laughter juxtaposed with arguments muted behind closed doors, expressions of love intertwined with palpable anxiety. It was a family caught between two worlds, one that demanded perfection and one that struggled with imperfection. And in trying to reconcile these two realities, Rob and Michelle made choices that, at the time, seemed protective. But as history would show, these choices were also dangerous. Even the staff at the estate noticed the difference between appearances and reality. Housekeepers spoke of rooms kept meticulously clean while tension simmered in the air. Drivers and aides recalled sudden shifts in Nick's mood, which would send the adults scrambling to maintain calm. These small incidents, repeated over years, were symptoms of a larger issue, one that no amount of wealth, influence, or careful management could fully contain. In Hollywood, image is everything. The Reiners understood this better than most. They knew that their public persona, a loving, successful family, was not just a brand, but a shield against intrusion. And yet, the shield that protects can also isolate. By hiding the cracks, they created an environment where help was limited, where intervention was delayed, and where the full weight of Nick's struggles went largely unaddressed. But there were moments that even the Reiners could not entirely control. Flashpoints that revealed the underlying instability. Moments when Nick's volatility could not be hidden, even behind the walls of wealth and secrecy. Friends, neighbors, and family members began to notice. Whispers became murmurs, and murmurs carried a weight of their own. The tension, carefully managed for years, was edging toward a breaking point. And yet, for all the warning signs, the world continued to see the Reiners as a model family. That contrast, the perfect image versus the imperfect reality, is what makes this story so compelling. It is also what sets the stage for the revelations to come. Because no amount of charm, no measure of influence, can erase the consequences of unresolved conflict, hidden trauma, and parental choices made in secrecy. What do you do when the child you love begins to show signs of real danger, not to the world, but to themselves and those around them? For the Reiners, this question wasn't hypothetical. It became a daily reality as Nick entered his teenage years. At first, the signs were subtle: missed appointments, fleeting irritability, moments of withdrawn silence. But over time, those signs escalated into something more alarming: violent outbursts, rage-filled episodes, and behaviors that made even Rob and Michelle feel powerless. Nick was no ordinary teenager. He had the advantages of wealth, access to the best schools, and exposure to the brightest minds. But he also carried a volatility that couldn't be disciplined away or explained as typical adolescent rebellion. Friends recalled incidents at parties, school events, and even casual gatherings where Nick would lash out unpredictably. Objects thrown, voices raised, doors slammed. Small infractions at first, but increasingly serious over time. Those closest to him described a boy who was smart, charming, and magnetic, yet frighteningly unpredictable. And the worst part? The Reiners were often the first, and sometimes the only, ones to witness it. Imagine the pressure. Your child is out of control, yet you are also a public figure whose reputation and career depend on maintaining an image of success and stability. For Rob, a man who had spent decades crafting narratives on film, the idea of narrative control wasn't just professional. It was personal, but reality doesn't always conform to the script. And as Nick's behavior escalated, Rob faced a choice every parent dreads: intervene in a way that might expose the family to scrutiny, or attempt to manage the problem in private, shielding both the child and the family's public image. The incidents were not isolated. Teachers reported moments of aggression in school, Nick snapping at peers, throwing objects, and in some cases, threatening behavior that required intervention. Coaches and mentors noticed mood swings and volatility during team sports or rehearsals. At home, the atmosphere shifted depending on Nick's mood. A calm morning could spiral into chaos by afternoon. Household staff began to recognize patterns, certain triggers that could ignite anger, the quiet tension before an episode, the aftermath of apologies and promises that often felt empty. Michelle, always the stabilizing force, attempted to manage the environment to minimize triggers. Rooms were organized, schedules meticulously planned, social interactions carefully monitored. Yet, no amount of structure could contain what was happening inside Nick's mind. Rob, for his part, oscillated between frustration, fear, and guilt. He wanted to help his son, to protect him from the consequences of his actions, but he also wanted to protect the family name, their standing, and the image of normalcy they had built over decades. It's worth pausing to consider just how isolating this must have been. Nick, despite his charm and intelligence, was struggling internally in ways that few could understand. And his parents, though well-intentioned, were navigating their own pressures, fame, wealth, and the constant scrutiny of Hollywood society. What might have been a manageable crisis for an average family became a complex tangle of secrecy, fear, and denial in the Reiner household. Even among friends, there were hints that something was off. Playdates and casual hangouts often ended abruptly after uncharacteristic outbursts. Teachers, while sympathetic to the pressures of celebrity children, could only do so much within the walls of school. Neighbors whispered about tense moments or strange incidents, but most kept their distance, unwilling to interfere in what seemed like a private family matter. In many ways, the Reiners' wealth and influence insulated them, even as it failed to solve the underlying issues. The turning point came with incidents that could no longer be ignored. One of the earliest documented violent episodes involved Nick at age 16 during a heated argument with a family friend. What began as a verbal disagreement escalated into physical aggression. Objects were broken, voices screamed, and the room filled with fear. Michelle reportedly tried to calm the situation, while Rob attempted to mediate, but the intensity of Nick's reaction was alarming, even to them. It was clear, this was no longer typical teenage rebellion. Something deeper, more dangerous, was at play. That incident marked the beginning of a series of escalating behaviors that culminated in the event that would change the course of Nick's life forever. By age 17, it became clear that private intervention was necessary. But even then, the question loomed: how do you handle a violent, unpredictable child when the world is watching, when privacy is both a shield and a trap? The answer they chose would haunt the family for decades. Throughout this period, Rob reportedly struggled with feelings of guilt and fear. He knew that sending Nick to a psychiatric facility might be the best way to ensure his safety and the safety of others. But it would also mean exposing a part of the family that they had worked so hard to keep private. The decision weighed heavily on him. He later admitted that covering it up, using influence to bury records and protect Nick's reputation, was his biggest mistake as a father. At the time, it may have seemed like protection. In hindsight, it became a moment where secrecy started to set the stage for tragedy. The teen years are formative for anyone, but in Nick's case, They were transformative in ways that were both unseen and unavoidable. The behaviors, unchecked and hidden, began to shape his personality, his coping mechanisms, and his understanding of consequences. Without proper intervention, the seeds of volatility were left to grow, nurtured in an environment where appearance often mattered more than intervention. This raises a difficult question for the audience. If you were in Rob's position, what would you have done? How far would you go to protect your child? And at what point does protection become concealment? And concealment become complicity? These are not easy questions, and the Reiners' answers were complicated, imperfect, and ultimately catastrophic. By the end of Nick's teenage years, the family reached a critical juncture. The incidents could no longer be managed quietly. Friends were aware, teachers were concerned, and even family members within the household felt the tension rising. The need for professional intervention was undeniable. The path forward, however, was fraught with moral and ethical dilemmas, decisions that would echo through the years and ultimately culminate in tragedy. Imagine being 17 years old and knowing that something inside you has gone so far off course that the only way to find help is to be removed from your home, your friends, your school, and the life you've known. For Nick Reiner, this was not a hypothetical situation. It became his reality. After years of escalating outbursts, unpredictable behavior, and violent incidents that could no longer be contained, Rob and Michelle made the difficult decision to send him to a private psychiatric facility. But unlike most families, the Reiners could afford not only treatment but discretion, and discretion became the guiding principle of this chapter of Nick's life. The facility itself was highly exclusive, designed to treat teens with severe behavioral or psychological issues while maintaining privacy for high-profile families. Patients received intensive therapy, both individual and group, while staff monitored daily routines with precision. The goal, at least on paper, was rehabilitation, helping young people develop coping mechanisms, understand their emotions, and integrate back into society. But for Nick, the experience was complicated, confusing, and emotionally turbulent. Arriving at the institution, Nick found himself in an environment structured to be safe, yet alienating. Everything about the facility was calculated: schedules, interactions, even the design of the rooms intended to minimize triggers. But the isolation was palpable. Being cut off from family and friends, even temporarily, can be traumatic for a teenager. For someone already struggling with intense emotions, the sense of separation can feel like punishment, and for Nick, it would sow seeds of resentment that lingered long after the stay. Rob and Michelle, meanwhile, faced a paradox. They were doing the right thing for their son's safety and well-being, but doing it quietly meant bending ethics in ways that could not be undone. Using Hollywood influence, lawyers, and private networks, they ensured that Nick's institutionalization remained invisible to the public, the press, and even much of their extended circle. School records were adjusted, medical confidentiality was invoked aggressively, and anyone who could inadvertently leak information was warned to stay silent. In doing so, they created a dual reality: a family publicly untouched, and a teenager privately wrestling with issues few would ever know existed. It's important to grasp what this concealment meant psychologically for Nick. Being institutionalized is often a vulnerable, disorienting experience. Being institutionalized while knowing the world has no idea, while feeling the need to hide your struggles even from those who love you most, can magnify feelings of isolation, shame, and anger. The Reiner's choice to hide his placement, though intended as protection, unintentionally reinforced a message: that seeking help is something to be ashamed of, a secret to be buried. Inside the facility, Nick's days were regimented. Therapy sessions were intense, designed to challenge his behavior and thought patterns. Staff observed every interaction for signs of aggression or emotional instability. Group therapy sessions forced him to confront behaviors he could no longer deny, while individual counseling aimed to unpack the underlying triggers. Yet for a teenager already resistant to authority, these measures were met with mixed results. Progress was often uneven. Moments of insight were countered by flare-ups of anger and frustration. And then there were the emotional consequences. Nick, like many teens in treatment, had to face a version of himself he wasn't ready to acknowledge. The therapeutic process required vulnerability, which can be both liberating and terrifying. Some sessions brought tears, confessions, and self-reflection. Others sparked defiance, resistance, and even violence within the safe confines of the facility. Staff worked tirelessly, but even the best care cannot erase years of cumulative trauma, poor coping strategies, and the weight of secrecy. Meanwhile, back at the Reiner estate, life carried on with an eerie normalcy. Michelle and Rob maintained their public appearances, attended events, and continued to nurture their other children, all while managing a gnawing anxiety about the choices they had made. Every phone call from the facility, every report of progress or regression, carried with it both relief and dread. They were doing their best, yet they knew that public scrutiny, if it ever arrived, could destroy not just their image, but their lives. This secrecy, this dual existence, created an unintended consequence. Nick internalized it. He understood, perhaps subconsciously, that his struggles were something to be hidden, something shameful. The pattern of behavior that had led to his institutionalization, the anger, the aggression, the volatility, was now compounded by secrecy, by the feeling that he could not fully exist as himself, even within the confines of family. By the end of his stay at the facility, Nick had learned certain skills, and staff hoped he had gained insight into his behavior. But he also carried with him a deeper anger and a lingering mistrust. What was meant to rehabilitate became, in part, a source of resentment. And this resentment, carefully masked in the years that followed, would quietly influence his relationships, his actions, and ultimately, the chain of events leading to tragedy. It is easy to judge from the outside. Why hide it, one might ask? Why not be transparent? But for Rob and Michelle, transparency was a risk, not just for Nick, but for the family's career, reputation, and social standing. And yet, the question remains, can reputation outweigh the long-term psychological consequences for a child? The Reiners chose privacy, and in doing so, unknowingly set the stage for events that would escalate beyond anyone's control. This chapter of Nick's life raises another difficult question. What does it mean to intervene correctly? Sending him to a psychiatric facility was, by many measures, the right decision. But when combined with secrecy, social isolation, and the weight of unspoken shame, it became a catalyst for deeper issues. It is a lesson in the delicate balance between protection and concealment, one that the Reiners would come to regret, but not before history revealed its full impact. Nick returned from the facility as a young adult with knowledge, insight, and coping tools, but also with unresolved anger and the lingering effects of isolation. The behavioral patterns that had necessitated intervention had been disrupted but not eradicated, and the secrecy surrounding his treatment became an invisible burden, something that weighed on him silently, coloring his interactions, his relationships, and his sense of self. The secret institution was meant to save him, but it was also a turning point. It was here that the trajectory of Nick's life and the Reiners' family legacy shifted in ways they could not have anticipated. The isolation, the concealed trauma, and the hidden anger all converged to form a foundation for the difficult years ahead, years that would ultimately culminate in events that shocked the world and shattered the image of the perfect Hollywood family. Imagine making a decision you believe is for the good of your child, only to realize that the very act meant to protect could also endanger everything around you. For Rob and Michelle Reiner, sending Nick to a private psychiatric facility was a decision steeped in love, fear, and a profound desire to preserve both their son's future and their family's image. But in Hollywood, where privacy is a commodity and reputation is everything, protection often comes with a price. And for the Reiners, that price was secrecy, and secrecy, as history shows, can be as dangerous as the problem it attempts to hide. From the moment Nick was institutionalized, Rob and Michelle understood that public knowledge could change everything. A parent in a similar situation might feel isolated enough dealing with a child's mental health struggles, but imagine adding the relentless glare of Hollywood scrutiny. Every move, every decision could be turned into gossip, speculation, or scandal. To avoid this, the Reiners went to extraordinary lengths to conceal the truth. Lawyers were hired to manage documentation. Medical records were carefully controlled. Any mention of Nick's treatment outside the family was off limits. Even the school system was informed selectively, creating a sanitized narrative that made it appear as if Nick had simply taken a short leave or been reassigned for personal reasons. This meticulous orchestration of secrecy was not merely bureaucratic. It was psychological. The Reiners understood that the world perceived them as a model family, and that perception had value. It protected their careers, their social standing, and the delicate public narrative they had spent decades building. But it also meant that no one outside the family fully understood the gravity of Nick's situation, and in many ways, the family itself had to pretend as though everything were normal. Inside the household, this secrecy created tension that no one could easily see. Staff, friends, and extended family knew something was happening, but they were kept at arm's length. Certain topics were avoided, questions deflected, and explanations vague. Romy, the eldest, sensed the unease, noticing that when Nick's name came up, conversations would shift or stop altogether. Even Rob and Michelle had to navigate conversations carefully, balancing honesty with discretion, constantly recalculating how much to reveal and to whom. The consequences of this concealment extended beyond mere appearances. By hiding Nick's struggles, the Reiners unintentionally isolated him from the support systems that could have helped him more effectively. Friends and relatives who might have intervened, offered guidance, or simply been witnesses to his challenges were left in the dark. While the intention was protection, the effect was a deepening of alienation for Nick, a boy who already felt different, volatile, and misunderstood. Rob, in particular, carried a burden that only increased over time. On one hand, he was proud of his career and the life he had built. On the other, he was painfully aware that the choices he made to conceal Nick's struggles might have been flawed. He later described it as his biggest mistake as a father. A confession that reflects not only regret, but also the realization that secrecy, no matter how well-intentioned, has limits. Protecting someone from the world does not always protect them from themselves. Meanwhile, Michelle took on the emotional labor of maintaining a calm, functional household. She ensured that the other children felt safe and loved, that staff followed strict protocols, and that social interactions remained controlled. Yet beneath this meticulous orchestration, anxiety lingered. The knowledge of what was hidden, combined with the unpredictable nature of Nick's behavior, created an undercurrent of tension that pervaded every corner of the estate. Outside the home, Hollywood operated as both shield and mirror. Contacts in the industry, trusted lawyers, and carefully managed media narratives ensured that Nick's institutionalization remained a secret. Any rumors were swiftly addressed or deflected. Magazine profiles, interviews, and public appearances all reinforced the image of a family intact, harmonious, and thriving. To the world, the Reiners appeared untouchable. But in truth, they were navigating a house of cards built on secrecy, anxiety, and unspoken truths. The act of covering up the truth was not only logistical. It was ethical, psychological, and emotional. Rob and Michelle were constantly weighing the consequences of disclosure against the risks of concealment. Every decision was a gamble. Would revealing the truth help Nick by normalizing mental health care, or would it expose him to ridicule, judgment, or career obstacles? Would keeping the secret protect him, or deepen his sense of isolation and resentment? They had no perfect answer, only instinct, love, and fear guiding their choices. And yet, the very secrecy intended to protect became a kind of pressure cooker. Nick was learning that his actions had consequences, but the consequences were selectively applied, inconsistent, and opaque. He knew something was happening, but he didn't have the language, the support, or the context to fully understand it. Over time, this contributed to a simmering resentment, a feeling that the world had wronged him in ways he could not articulate, combined with the knowledge that his parents controlled the narrative entirely. It is a paradox. The more the Reiners tried to protect their son and their family's reputation, the more they may have contributed to a cycle of misunderstanding, anger, and secrecy that would ultimately spiral out of control. Experts later suggest that this dynamic, parental concealment combined with adolescent volatility, can intensify feelings of isolation and mistrust, particularly in young adults struggling with mental health issues. Yet in the moment, Rob and Michelle were navigating a delicate tightrope. They had made the decision they believed was best, to intervene in a private way, shield their son from public scrutiny, and preserve the family's stability. Every phone call from the facility, every progress report, every private conversation with lawyers and therapists reinforced the careful choreography they had created. But the burden of secrecy was heavy, and even the best intentions can carry unforeseen consequences. By the end of Nick's stay, the Reiners faced a reality that would shape the rest of their lives. The young man who returned home was changed, carrying both the tools of therapy and the hidden weight of resentment. The family remained publicly intact, but the cracks beneath the surface were deepening. The tension between public perception and private reality set the stage for the struggles, conflicts, and tragedies that would emerge in the decades to follow. What would you do if the secret you had been keeping for decades suddenly felt like a weight too heavy to carry? For Rob Reiner, that moment came in the final years of his life. After decades of carefully managing the Reiner family's public image, of shielding his son Nick from scrutiny, and of burying uncomfortable truths, Rob finally admitted something that had haunted him for years. He revealed the reality that no one outside the inner circle had ever known. Nick had been institutionalized as a teenager, a fact hidden from the public, from friends, and even from most extended family. This confession was not casual or offhand. It was raw, emotional, and delivered with a sense of gravity that underscored years of internal struggle. Rob acknowledged that while his intentions had always been to protect his son, the choice to conceal the truth was, in hindsight, a mistake, perhaps his biggest one as a father. The admission was a moment of vulnerability, a crack in the armor of Hollywood perfection, revealing a father who loved his son but also feared the consequences of honesty. Rob's confession also laid bare a series of difficult questions. How much should a parent reveal about a child's struggles? How do you balance love, protection, and the public's perception? And most importantly, when does secrecy stop being a shield and start becoming a burden? These questions weighed heavily on Rob, and he knew that his silence had allowed fear and misunderstanding to take root in ways that could not easily be undone. The timing of Rob's admission is significant. In the weeks and months leading up to his death, he began speaking more openly about the choices he had made, the mistakes, and the regrets. Interviews, private conversations with close friends, and even some personal writings hinted at a man trying to reconcile the public perception of his family with the private reality he had lived with for decades. Each confession was a piece of the puzzle, revealing the depth of his concern, his guilt, and his hope that acknowledgement might somehow prevent further harm. Rob's confession also revealed the complexity of parenthood, particularly in families under public scrutiny. He spoke about the difficult balance between love and accountability, the challenge of recognizing that a child can be both loved and dangerous, brilliant and troubled. He admitted that sending Nick to a psychiatric facility had been necessary, but that the choice to cover it up had unintended consequences, shaping Nick's understanding of himself and his behavior in ways that may have contributed to later events. It is worth pausing to consider the human side of this confession. Rob was not merely recounting facts. He was expressing deep regret, fear, and a desire for understanding. He wanted people to know that his actions, while flawed, had been motivated by love. He wanted the world to understand the complexity of parenting a child like Nick, someone whose behavior could be alarming, unpredictable, and dangerous, yet who still deserved compassion, guidance, and protection. But even as Rob confessed, he faced the tension of knowing that some truths cannot fully be resolved. While he could admit to past mistakes, he could not undo the years of secrecy, the emotional consequences for Nick, or the eventual trajectory that would lead to tragedy. His confession was an attempt at transparency, an acknowledgement of responsibility, and a cry for understanding, all rolled into one. Friends and colleagues who heard parts of Rob's confession were struck by its honesty and emotional weight. Many noted that it revealed a side of him rarely seen in public, vulnerable, introspective, and painfully aware of his own limitations as a parent. Rob's willingness to speak openly about mistakes that could have long-term consequences underscored both his humanity and the tragedy of the family situation. The confession also served as a mirror for the audience, forcing a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about secrecy, privilege, and accountability. Rob's story is not unique in Hollywood or beyond. Many families face challenges they choose to hide. Yet the scale of the Reiners' choices, compounded by wealth, influence, and the eventual consequences, highlights the potential dangers of concealment, even when motivated by love. Rob's confession did more than reveal the past. It set the stage for understanding the events that would follow. It contextualized Nick's behavior, the family dynamics, and the hidden pressures that had built over decades. By admitting the truth, Rob illuminated a chain of decisions that, while made with the best intentions, may have contributed to an environment ripe for tragedy. And in that confession, there was also a sense of finality. Rob knew that he might not have the opportunity to correct everything, to fully make amends, or to shield the family from the consequences of past decisions. His words carried a weight that was both confessional and cautionary, a reminder that secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, can shape lives in ways that are irreversible. The impact of Rob's confession extends beyond personal reflection. It forces a reevaluation of the Reiner family narrative, reshaping how the public and history perceives them. The perfect Hollywood family, the one admired and envied, now exists alongside the reality of complex, human struggles: a son institutionalized, a father torn between protection and honesty, a mother navigating fear and responsibility. The contrast is stark, emotional, and deeply compelling. As we move forward, it becomes clear that Rob's confession was more than a revelation. It was a warning, a lens through which to view the actions, reactions, and consequences that followed. Understanding his admission is crucial to understanding the tragedy that would unfold, the choices that could not be undone, and the legacy left in its wake. Imagine walking into a room you have known your entire life, only to find it transformed into a scene of unimaginable horror. For Romy Reiner, 27 years old at the time, that nightmare became reality on December 14th. She had grown up in the Brentwood estate, familiar with every hallway, every corner, every creaking floorboard. She knew the rhythm of the house, the laughter, the occasional tension, the quiet moments that were just between family. But on that day, everything changed. The home she had trusted as a sanctuary had become a scene of unspeakable violence. Romy was the first to discover her parents' bodies. The details are haunting. Multiple sharp force injuries, the result of a brutal attack that ended the lives of two people who had shaped her world. Michelle, elegant and composed in life, was now still, lifeless, the vibrancy she carried for decades extinguished. Rob, the towering figure of creativity, humor, and love, lay motionless as well, a tragic testament to a violence that no one had anticipated. The room was silent except for the faint sounds of emergency personnel arriving, but the silence was deafening, filled with the weight of grief, shock, and disbelief. In the chaos, Romy did something remarkable. She acted. Despite the trauma she had just witnessed, she told the authorities something critical. There was a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. Her words, calm yet resolute, were both a warning and a plea. In that moment, Romy's clarity amid grief provided a critical lead to investigators. She understood something fundamental about the dynamics in her family, something the world would soon come to grapple with in full detail. The discovery was not only traumatic, but also deeply complex emotionally. Romy had grown up witnessing tension, volatility, and secrecy within the household, particularly surrounding her brother Nick. She had observed, perhaps better than anyone outside the inner circle, the undercurrents of fear, frustration, and anger that permeated family interactions. Yet nothing could have prepared her for the culmination of that tension in such a violent, irreversible act. Romy's role as a witness is both poignant and terrifying. She was no stranger to the complexities of her family. She had grown up navigating Nick's moods, understanding the careful orchestration of household dynamics, and witnessing the subtle ways in which Rob and Michelle tried to shield the family from the consequences of past decisions. But the sheer scale of what she encountered on that day was unprecedented. It was as if the very secrets that had been buried for years had erupted, leaving devastation in their wake. In the immediate aftermath, investigators began piecing together the events leading up to the murders. Romy's testimony was crucial. She indicated that the danger may have come from within, identifying a family member whose potential for violence had long been observed but never fully confronted. That insight, combined with forensic evidence, would later focus the investigation on Nick Reiner. The implications were staggering. A son accused of taking the lives of the very people who had tried to protect him. The emotional weight for Romy cannot be overstated. Discovering the bodies of her parents was not just a traumatic event. It was the collapse of the family she had known and loved. The Reiner household, once a place of structure, privilege, and seemingly unshakable stability, had become a scene of tragedy. Romy's understanding of the family dynamics, the hidden anger, the unresolved tensions, the secrets, suddenly provided context, but no comfort. She was now a witness to history, a participant in a narrative that would shock the world. Adding to the complexity was the fact that Romy had long been aware of the challenges within the family. She had seen the volatility of her brother, the careful management of his behavior by her parents, and the unspoken rules that governed the household. Yet the ultimate act of violence was something she could not have foreseen. The combination of past secrets, unaddressed behavioral issues, and familial dynamics had culminated in a tragedy that was both personal and public, intimate and shocking. The police and investigators, armed with Romy's testimony, began reconstructing the night of the murders. They considered every variable: the timing, the location, the relationships, and the history of tension within the family. Romy's insight provided a crucial thread: a recognition that the danger had not come from a stranger, but from someone known, someone whose volatility had been observed for years yet never fully confronted. Her discovery also raised difficult questions for the public. How could a family so celebrated, so seemingly perfect, experience such a catastrophe from within? How could the son of two loving, attentive parents reach a point where violence became inevitable? These questions reverberated beyond the walls of the Reiner estate, sparking debates about parenting, mental health, privilege, and accountability. Yet even as Romy navigated grief, shock, and fear, she demonstrated remarkable presence of mind. She provided details, answered questions, and cooperated fully with investigators, balancing her personal trauma with the practical necessity of ensuring the truth could be uncovered. Her actions underscored a critical truth. In families with complex dynamics, the awareness and courage of one individual can become pivotal in moments of crisis. The discovery also highlighted a tragic irony. For decades, Rob and Michelle had tried to protect their son by hiding his past struggles, covering up institutionalization, and maintaining a veneer of perfection. Yet those very efforts, intended as safeguards, could not prevent the culmination of hidden tensions. Romy's encounter with the aftermath was a stark reminder that secrets, even those kept out of love, have a way of resurfacing, and sometimes with devastating consequences. Romy's testimony would later be a cornerstone of the investigation, offering both insight and clarity. She illuminated the patterns of behavior, the history of volatility, and the familial undercurrents that had gone unnoticed or unaddressed by outsiders. Her perspective bridged the gap between public perception and private reality, revealing a story that was far more complex and tragic than anyone had imagined. And yet, despite the clarity she provided, the emotional impact of that day would haunt her forever. She had stepped into a nightmare, seen the consequences of decades of secrecy, and been forced to confront the terrifying reality of her family's collapse. Her discovery marked not only the beginning of a police investigation, but also a profound personal reckoning. The understanding that the family she had known, loved, and navigated all her life had been shaped by secrets, fear, and unaddressed volatility. Imagine a night so ordinary in its beginning that nothing hints at the horror to come. For the Reiners, December 14th started like many other days in the Brentwood estate. Quiet routines, small tasks, and the rhythm of a household accustomed to structure. Rob and Michelle were at home, Nick in the guest house, and Romy moving between spaces as she managed daily responsibilities. Yet within hours, this ordinary night would erupt into tragedy, altering the family forever and shocking the world. Details of that evening, pieced together from police reports, witness statements, and family accounts, paint a chilling picture. The exact timeline remains complex, but certain elements are clear. Tension had been simmering beneath the surface, and Nick, whose history of volatility was well documented within the family, became the focal point. The decades of hidden anger, unaddressed trauma, and secrecy converged in a violent crescendo. What happened inside the estate that night is a stark reminder that unresolved family dynamics can explode in ways no one anticipates. Nick's behavior that evening is described as erratic and aggressive. Neighbors reported hearing unusual sounds from the property, loud bangs, sharp voices, and a sense of agitation that was atypical for the usually quiet household. Staff and friends who were nearby later recalled feeling an unnatural tension around the estate, a sense that something was off even before the discovery of the bodies. These early signs, small and easily dismissible on their own, would later be understood as harbingers of the tragic events to come. Inside the home, the confrontation escalated rapidly. Details indicate that a dispute, possibly over personal grievances, long-standing tensions, or a sudden emotional trigger, spilled over into violence. The exact catalyst may never be fully known, but what is evident is the intensity and finality of the attack. Multiple sharp force injuries were inflicted on Rob and Michelle, resulting in their immediate deaths. The brutality of the act was both shocking and deeply tragic, emphasizing the dangerous intersection of untreated behavioral issues and years of secrecy. Romy's discovery, as we previously covered, was the first human response to the aftermath. Her reaction, calm, direct, and precise, provided investigators with crucial insight. By identifying a dangerous family member as a potential suspect, she immediately pointed attention toward Nick, a step that arguably prevented further complications or misdirection in the investigation. The clarity of her account underscores not only the shock of the moment, but also the depth of her understanding of her family dynamics. For the Reiners, the night was the catastrophic culmination of years of hidden struggle. Nick's institutionalization as a teenager, the secrecy surrounding it, and the ongoing tension within the household had all contributed to an environment primed for volatility. What may have begun as a moment of emotional loss of control quickly escalated into irreversible violence. The contrast between the family's public image of perfection and the private reality of conflict, fear, and anger had never been starker. The investigation that followed focused immediately on the estate, the family dynamics, and Nick's role. Police described the scene as meticulously documented, analyzing every detail from the point of entry, the positioning of the bodies, and forensic evidence left at the scene. This careful analysis, coupled with Romy's testimony, created a coherent narrative that investigators could piece together. The conclusion was both shocking and tragically predictable. Nick, the son whose volatility had been managed but never fully resolved, became the prime suspect in the deaths of his parents. The arrests and charges that followed shocked the public. Nick Reiner was taken into custody that very night, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Media outlets immediately speculated, reported, and debated the implications. Headlines highlighted the stark contrast between the glamorous lives of Hollywood elites and the shocking violence that had erupted in their midst. Public fascination mixed with horror as details of the family's history, previously unknown, began to surface, slowly revealing the hidden struggles that had preceded the tragedy. This night also forced reflection on broader questions about parenting, mental health, and secrecy. Could earlier intervention, more transparency, or different choices have prevented this outcome? Were Rob and Michelle's decades of careful management ultimately sufficient, or did their efforts inadvertently contribute to the environment in which this violence became possible? These questions, painful and complex, illustrate the devastating intersection of family dynamics, unaddressed behavioral health issues, and the pressure of maintaining a public image. For the Reiner children, the emotional toll was immeasurable. Romy, having discovered the bodies, faced the immediate trauma of witnessing violence firsthand. For Nick, the trajectory that began with hidden outbursts, teenage institutionalization, and secrecy culminated in the worst possible consequence. The psychological and emotional context of this night is both tragic and deeply instructive, offering insight into how unresolved conflict and concealed behavioral issues can escalate in ways that no one anticipates. The night of the murders marks a pivotal turning point in the Reiner story. It is the tragic apex of decades of secrecy, the culmination of unaddressed behavioral issues, and the dramatic unraveling of a family once thought to be untouchable. Every element, from teenage volatility to private institutionalization, from parental concealment to the eventual violent act, intertwines to form a narrative of caution, sorrow, and reflection. What happens when a seemingly perfect family implodes in the most violent, unimaginable way? For law enforcement and investigators, the Reiner murders presented a case that was both tragic and complex, a labyrinth of privilege, secrecy, and hidden tensions. The scene at the Brentwood estate was meticulously examined, every corner analyzed, every detail cataloged, as authorities sought to reconstruct a night that had left the world in shock. The investigation began immediately after Romy's discovery. Her calm, direct testimony identified a family member as a potential suspect, a rare clarity in the midst of trauma. Police secured the estate, combed through forensic evidence, and began interviewing anyone connected to the family. Staff, friends, neighbors, and associates in the entertainment industry. Each person provided pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, revealed not just the events of that night, but decades of hidden family history. Investigators focused on Nick Reiner almost immediately. He had a known history of volatility, institutionalization as a teen, and behavioral issues that had been carefully managed but never fully addressed. Authorities noted that his past, while largely concealed from the public, offered insight into potential motives and psychological state. Every report from the psychiatric facility, every incident during his teenage years, became a critical piece of context. The family's long-standing efforts to cover up these struggles now intersected tragically with law enforcement's need for transparency. Forensic evidence played a pivotal role. The scene indicated multiple points of contact, signs of a struggle, and the use of sharp force that suggested intense emotion and a personal connection. Investigators meticulously cataloged every item, every mark, every trace of evidence, building a timeline of the fatal events. Surveillance footage, although limited within the private estate, was reviewed for movement and interactions between family members in the hours leading up to the murders. This combination of physical and testimonial evidence began to form a coherent narrative pointing to a domestic conflict that had escalated beyond control. Neighbors and staff provided additional insight. Some recalled unusual sounds, shouts, banging, moments of silence, echoing through the normally quiet neighborhood. Others mentioned previous tension in the household, subtle but persistent indicators of unresolved conflict. Investigators noted the contrast between the Reiners' public image and the private dynamics described by insiders, highlighting the complexities of managing a household where appearances masked reality. As the investigation deepened, authorities faced questions about the family's history, particularly the secretive measures surrounding Nick's teenage institutionalization. Lawyers and mental health professionals involved in Nick's care were contacted to provide records, subject to legal confidentiality agreements. The combination of hidden history and current forensic evidence painted a picture that was, at once, shocking yet consistent with long-standing behavioral patterns. Public reaction was immediate. Media outlets dissected the family's history, reporting on the wealth, influence, and privilege that had allowed for secrecy, while speculating about the psychological and emotional factors behind the tragedy. Headlines emphasized the shocking contrast between Hollywood glamour and domestic horror, raising questions about the responsibilities of parents, the impact of privilege, and the consequences of hidden behavioral issues. Social media amplified these debates, creating a complex web of public scrutiny and speculation. Investigators also focused on the psychology of the situation. Experts in behavioral analysis were consulted to understand the escalation from past volatility to lethal violence. They examined Nick's adolescent history, the secrecy surrounding his institutionalization, and the long-term impact of concealed trauma. Their conclusions highlighted a combination of risk factors: untreated emotional issues, familial secrecy, isolation, and a lack of consistent intervention. These factors, when compounded, created an environment where tragedy became increasingly likely. Family dynamics were central to the investigation. Romy's testimony revealed not only her immediate discovery of the crime, but also her understanding of long-standing patterns of volatility and tension. Her insights were crucial for establishing motive, context, and behavioral expectations within the household. Investigators noted her ability to articulate these patterns with clarity, underscoring the depth of her awareness of family dynamics prior to the event. As the investigation progressed, authorities began to reconstruct the timeline leading to the murders. They analyzed movements, interactions, and previous conflicts, looking for triggers or patterns that could explain the escalation. Every detail mattered: the positioning of furniture, the placement of objects, the sequence of interactions. Forensic experts mapped out each element, seeking to create a cohesive narrative that could stand in court while also illuminating the human tragedy at the heart of the case. Meanwhile, legal considerations complicated the process. Nick's past institutionalization and behavioral history were protected under strict confidentiality agreements, requiring investigators to navigate privacy laws while pursuing justice. This delicate balance highlighted the tension between transparency, accountability, and the protection of sensitive information, an ethical complexity that added layers to an already challenging investigation. The investigation also revealed the broader implications of privilege